The storm had arrived earlier than predicted, and its wrath was unrelenting. Rain hammered against the large glass windows of St. Clair Memorial, casting distorted reflections of flickering fluorescent lights inside the bustling ER. Dr. Mia Harper pressed her back against the nurse's station, taking a brief moment to catch her breath. The heavy air of exhaustion weighed on her shoulders after 14 hours of non-stop patients, most of them victims of the massive highway pileup just a few miles away. Mia glanced toward the front doors as thunder rolled ominously through the air. A crowd of soaked paramedics rushed in, wheeling gurneys with broken bodies covered in rain-drenched blankets. Amid the chaos, she noticed something strange, a faint black mist curling along the floor, slipping through the automatic doors with the storm. She blinked, shaking off the thought. Just fog, she muttered under her breath, trying to convince herself it was nothing more than weather quirks. Her reprieve was interrupted by a nurse's voice. "Dr. Harper, we need you in room 3. Patient's coding." Without hesitation, Mia hurried to the room. The patient, a frail man in his 70s, was gasping, his chest heaving unnaturally. The nurses worked frantically around him, but the man's eyes locked on Mia as she entered. "It's coming for us," he rasped, his voice hoarse and broken. Mia froze. "What's coming?" she asked, leaning closer, but the man's chest gave one final spasm before he lay still. The flatline tone of the heart monitor pierced the room. As the nurses stepped back, Mia glanced over her shoulder toward the entrance again. The mist was still there, curling slowly, as if watching and waiting. The storm outside intensified, rattling the hospital's windows and sending surges of static through the overhead intercom. Mia remained tense after the man's cryptic warning, but there was no time to dwell on it. Patients needed her attention. Yet as the minutes dragged on, the sense of unease that had settled over the ER refused to leave. The first power outage hit suddenly. The lights flickered once, then went out, plunging the hospital into darkness. Emergency lights sputtered to life moments later, bathing the halls in a dim red glow. The sterile, modern facility now looked like the setting of a nightmare. "The generators should have kicked in," a nurse muttered nervously. Mia grabbed a flashlight from the nurse's station and pointed it down the hallway. In the beam's glow, she saw the black mist again, thicker now, pooling near the ICU doors. It swirled unnaturally, seeming to defy the windless interior of the hospital. "Dr. Harper," someone called urgently. "ICU patient is having a seizure." Mia rushed to the ICU, where a middle-aged man writhed violently on his bed. The attending nurse was trying to restrain him, but his strength seemed inhuman. As Mia approached, the man's eyes snapped open, wide with terror. "Do you see it?" he cried, his voice guttural and raw. "It's here." Before Mia could respond, the man arched his back and fell limp. The heart monitor flatlined, the steady beep echoing eerily. She checked his vitals, but he was gone. Then she heard it, faint, almost imperceptible. A whisper. "Mia." She whipped around, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The hall behind her was empty, save for the mist, which had grown thicker and darker, slithering closer. By the time the hospital's emergency systems were partially restored, panic had begun to spread. Patients cried out from their rooms, and staff rushed in every direction, their fear palpable. The mist had crept further into the hospital, filling the hallways and cutting off entire wings. Mia tried to keep her team calm. She directed nurses to prioritize moving critical patients to safer areas. But the mist was relentless, oozing through vents, under doors, and around windows. The temperature in the hospital dropped noticeably, and an unnatural silence settled in patches, broken only by the occasional burst of static over the intercom. One of the nurses, Rachel, disappeared while transferring a patient. Mia found her minutes later in the East Wing, crumpled on the floor, her lips moving soundlessly. "Rachel!" Mia knelt beside her, shaking her gently. "What happened?" Rachel's eyes flickered open, wide with panic. "It was calling me," she whispered. It knows my name." Mia's blood ran cold. Soon after, more patients began vanishing. Mia entered a room, expecting to find an elderly woman awaiting surgery. But the bed was empty, save for the indentations in the sheets. No one had seen her leave. The same happened in 2 other rooms. No witnesses, no alarms, only silence. The whispers grew louder. Mia could hear them now even in the busier parts of the hospital. When she passed the ICU again, the mist was thicker than ever, writhing like a living thing. And through it, faint shapes began to appear, shadows that looked disturbingly human, pacing the halls, their movements jerky and wrong. Mia knew they were running out of time. "We need to seal off the wings," she told the remaining staff. "Keep the fog out and stay together." But deep down, she feared it wouldn't be enough. The whispers grew louder as the mist seeped further into the hospital. Mia tried to focus on leading her team, but every step closer to the fog felt like walking toward an inevitable doom. Her chest tightened as she thought of the patients still trapped in the eastern wing. She had to act, despite the fear gnawing at her resolve. "I'm going in," Mia announced to the remaining nurses. "Are you insane?" Rachel grabbed her arm. "No one who's gone into that fog has come back. I can't leave them to die," Mia said, pulling free. Equipped with a flashlight and a surgical mask as a pitiful defense against the mist, Mia stepped into the eastern wing. The fog enveloped her immediately, thick and suffocating, muffling all sound. Her flashlight barely penetrated the swirling blackness, which seemed to close in tighter with every step. Then she saw them, the shadows. Vague, humanoid figures moving just beyond the edge of her light. Their forms were blurred, but their eyes glowed faintly, fixed on her. "Mia!" The voice echoed through the fog, low and resonant. She froze as a shape emerged directly in front of her, a man with hollow, accusing eyes. It took her a moment to recognize him. "Mr. Patel," she whispered. He had been one of her first patients years ago. He died on her operating table during what should have been a routine surgery. "You let me die," the figure hissed. "You should have saved me." More shapes appeared, each one bearing a familiar face from her past. The teenager who'd succumbed to injuries after a car crash. The elderly woman whose heart had failed during a risky operation. "No," Mia choked out, backing away. "I did everything I could." The shadows advanced, their voices rising in a cacophony of blame and despair. The fog tightened around her, cold and suffocating, pulling her down. But then she heard another voice, a faint cry for help, distant but real. The patient. Summoning every ounce of courage, Mia surged forward, pushing through the shadows and the fog. Her fingers finally closed around an arm, and she dragged the patient, a young woman, back toward the light. The mist resisted her, clawing at her as if alive, but she broke through, collapsing into the clear air of the main hallway. Mia gasped for air as she and the patient tumbled into the safety of the main corridor. The fog didn't follow. It lingered at the edge of the light, writhing angrily before slowly retreating. Rachel and a few others rushed to help. "You made it," Rachel whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. The patient, though weak, was alive. Mia slumped against the wall, her body trembling from the ordeal. The fog had taken so much patience, staff, and something deeper, something she couldn't yet name. As the hours passed, the remaining survivors regrouped in the hospital's central atrium. Some sat in stunned silence, while others whispered prayers. Rachel hugged her knees to her chest, rocking slightly. Mia stared at the ICU doors, now eerily quiet. The black mist was gone, but the memory of its whispers lingered, faint and persistent in her mind. It felt like it was still watching her, biding its time. When dawn broke, the storm outside had cleared, and emergency responders finally arrived. The official explanation was quick and unsatisfying. A gas leak had caused hallucinations, panic, and power failures. But Mia knew the truth. Weeks later, St. Clair Memorial reopened, its halls scrubbed clean of the chaos from that stormy night. Patients filled the rooms again, and the staff tried to move on. But for Mia, the whispers never truly stopped. At first, they were faint, like echoes from a distant memory. But as the days passed, they grew louder, more distinct. until they became a nightly torment. "It's not over," she whispered to herself one evening, staring out the window of her apartment. Outside, the city lights sparkled under a clear sky. But in the distance, just beyond the horizon, a familiar black mist began to gather, curling and creeping toward the city like a predator stalking its prey. This time, when it called her name, Mia didn't look away. The evening shift was winding down at Blackwood General Hospital, but for Dr. Arthur Grayson, the workday was far from over. He sat in his office, reviewing patient files under the dim glow of a desk lamp. Outside the frosted window, the hum of fluorescent hallway lights filled the silence. A gust of wind rattled the glass, and Arthur shivered despite the room's warmth. It had been one of those days, a surgical complication in the morning, an argument with an administrator in the afternoon, and an overflowing ER that evening. Arthur rubbed his temples, his tired blue eyes scanning the chart in front of him. His once steady hands trembled slightly as he flipped a page. As he reached for another file, his fingers brushed against something unexpected in the back of the drawer. Frowning, he pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook coated in a thin layer of dust. It felt ancient, its edges worn and cracked, but when he opened it, the paper inside was oddly pristine. The first name he saw stopped him cold: Eleanor Haynes. His breath hitched. Eleanor had been his patient 2 years ago, a kind older woman who hadn't survived an aggressive cancer diagnosis despite his best efforts. The next name was familiar too. Another patient, another failure. Arthur flipped through the pages, dread building in his chest. Every name belonged to someone he had treated, someone who had died under his care. His pulse quickened when he reached the final page. Unlike the others, it had just one name, underlined and dated: Dr. Arthur Grayson, July 15th, 2024, a week from today. The notebook slipped from his hands, landing on the desk with a dull thud. He stared at it, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him like a leaden fog. Arthur sat motionless in his office, staring at the notebook as though it were a living thing. His fingers trembled as they hovered over the pages, afraid to touch the names within. He had seen patients die before, too many times. In fact, it was part of the job. But this was different. The book was a testament to every life lost on his watch, a reminder of his failures, and now it was predicting his own death. He couldn't shake the feeling that the notebook was more than a mere list. It was a death sentence, and he had been marked. He stood up abruptly and paced the room, trying to calm his racing thoughts. His mind began to race through the cases he'd handled over the years, wondering if his mistakes, his miscalculations, had led to these patients' untimely deaths. There was no rational explanation for the notebook, no way to prove its validity. Yet the terror that crept through him was undeniable. Later that night, as he tried to distract himself with paperwork, something strange happened. His pager went off. Frowning, he glanced at the display, Room 318. Room 318 had been closed for years. It had been the site of a tragic death, a case that haunted him still. The patient, a young man, had died unexpectedly in the middle of a routine procedure, and Arthur had never fully understood why. The pager buzzed again, and this time, it was accompanied by a message: Dr. Grayson, please report to Room 318 immediately. His heart skipped a beat. No one had been in Room 318 for ages. He glanced toward the hallway and saw the shadow of a nurse walking past. Her steps hurried. Arthur shook his head and tried to dismiss the unease crawling through his chest, but his feet carried him toward the room anyway, as if he were compelled by something beyond his control. As he neared the room, a cold draft brushed against him, and the air seemed to thicken. When he stepped inside, the lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. It was empty. The bed was neatly made, the space completely still. His breath came in shallow gasps as he walked toward the desk, where the faintest trace of mist lingered. "Who called me here?" he whispered, though he knew the answer. The notebook had brought him here. Arthur's hands shook as he placed the notebook on the desk, the worn leather cover still staring at him accusingly. He had hoped that by coming here, by facing his fears, the strange occurrences would stop, but they only intensified. The temperature dropped, his breath formed small clouds in the air, and the shadows seemed to shift. Suddenly, the room felt not quite right, as if he was no longer alone. Arthur Grayson. The voice was soft at first, almost a whisper, but it grew louder, and the air grew heavier with each syllable. He spun around, eyes darting to the corners of the room, but there was no one there. Then, the lights flickered once more, and when they returned, the room had changed. The walls seemed to stretch, and the door to the hallway had disappeared entirely. He was trapped. Before him, figures began to appear, slowly materializing from the mist. Faces all too familiar, yet distorted by pain and rage. Patients, all of them, the ones whose names had been in the book. "Why didn't you save me?" The voice came from a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with accusation. It was Eleanor Haynes, the woman whose name had been the first he had seen in the notebook. I tried," Arthur stammered, his throat dry. But the apparition stepped forward, her gaze cold and unforgiving. It wasn't enough. One by one, the others stepped forward, patients he had treated, whose deaths haunted him. Each one demanded answers, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of accusations. "You killed me. You let me die. You were supposed to save me." Arthur backed away, his head spinning. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the room grew darker. The whispers filled his ears, and his pulse raced with fear. He turned toward the notebook, now glowing faintly. The pages flipped on their own, revealing more names, new ones, names he didn't recognize. The final page, however, remained blank, except for a single word that appeared at the bottom: tomorrow. Arthur's breath hitched. The last entry was his own name, followed by the ominous date tomorrow. His eyes went wide. No, this can't be happening. But the shadows moved closer. Arthur bolted upright, gasping for air. He was back in his office, the room no longer cold, the faces of the dead patients gone. His hands were slick with sweat, and his heart pounded in his chest. Was it a dream, or had it been real? The notebook lay on the desk in front of him, as though nothing had happened. His name was still on the last page, still dated for tomorrow. The word tomorrow burned in his mind, echoing like a countdown to something inevitable. He tried to focus on the task at hand, work, but the unease gnawed at him. Every noise seemed amplified. The ticking of the clock, the hum of the hospital overhead lights. Every breath he took felt heavier. The following day, Arthur avoided the hospital. He couldn't bring himself to go back. His colleagues would call him irrational, but the fear that gripped him was undeniable. But the calls wouldn't stop. He received a message from a colleague, Dr. Evelyn, urgently asking him to come in. A complication had arisen with one of his longtime patients, an elderly man who had been under his care for months. Arthur hesitated, knowing what awaited him, but duty won out. He dressed quickly and left for the hospital, his mind racing with dread. He arrived in the operating room to find the elderly patient in critical condition. The procedure was delicate, but Arthur knew he could handle it. He tried to calm his nerves, but the pressure of the situation was too much. His chest tightened, and he felt dizzy. Before he could make the incision, he collapsed. His vision blurred, his body went numb, and the last thing he remembered was the familiar sensation of the notebook, now pressed against his chest. Days later, the hospital had returned to normal. Arthur's absence had left a hole, but life went on. His colleagues moved forward, continuing the work he had left behind. But none of them knew the truth. None of them knew the price Arthur had paid. Dr. Evelyn, Arthur's colleague, had found the notebook after the incident. She had been cleaning out his office when she discovered it. At first, she didn't understand its significance, but as she flipped through the pages, the name struck her with an unnerving familiarity. She paused on the last page. Arthur's name was underlined. The date, yesterday. Her breath caught in her throat. A chill ran down her spine. Suddenly, the pager on her desk went off, the screen flashing with a message. She stared at it, frozen. The number, room 318, A cold shiver crawled up her back as she looked at the notebook again. The cycle was about to begin anew. The hospital buzzed with the rhythm of a typical night shift. Doctors hurrying between wards, nurses adjusting IVs, the soft hum of medical machines filling the air. Dr. Clara Martinez glanced at her tablet, her sharp brown eyes scanning the patient directory for her final rounds of the evening. She was exhausted, her dark curly hair pinned back messily, but she took pride in finishing her work thoroughly. As she flipped through the list, a peculiar detail caught her attention. Room 137. She frowned. The hospital layout didn't have a room 137. She knew Blackwood Memorial like the back of her hand, and the hallway where the room should have been led directly to the old surgical wing, sealed off decades ago after renovations. Assuming it was a clerical error, she tapped the screen for more details, but found nothing. No diagnosis, no attending nurse, just a blank file. Curiosity pulled her toward the wing, her footsteps echoing faintly in the quiet corridor. As she neared the end of the hall, the air grew colder. The lights flickered overhead, and for a moment, she considered turning back. Then she saw it. A door labeled 137. Her heart skipped a beat. The door looked old, its paint chipped, and the metal numbers rusted. Taking a deep breath, she turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with only the soft glow of a bedside lamp illuminating the sparse furnishings. In the bed lay a frail, elderly man with hollow cheeks and piercing gray eyes. He turned to her as though he had been expecting her arrival. "Dr. Martinez," he said, his voice weak but deliberate. "I've been waiting for you." Clara blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" He gave a faint smile. "You might not know me, but I know you. I've been here for over a century, keeping this hospital safe. And now, my time is almost up." Clara left room 137 in a daze, her mind racing. She could still feel the elderly man's piercing gaze as his words echoed in her head. "For over a century, I've protected this place." It was absurd, and yet something about his tone carried a weight that was difficult to dismiss. The next morning, she searched for the room in the hospital directory. Nothing. Room 137 didn't exist. She asked colleagues about it, but they only gave her puzzled looks. Even the security footage of the wing showed a blank stretch of wall where the door should have been. "Maybe you were just overtired," one nurse suggested, patting Clara on the shoulder. But Clara wasn't so sure. That night, as she made her rounds, the air in the hospital seemed different, heavier, colder. The overhead lights flickered more often than usual, and she noticed small things that set her on edge. Hallways felt longer, stretching unnaturally, as if the walls were bending. Patients began complaining about strange sightings. "There was someone in my room," whispered Mrs. Lutz, a woman recovering from surgery, "standing in the corner, watching me." Clara tried to reassure her, but she couldn't shake the creeping unease. The shadows, it seemed, were everywhere now. Clara caught glimpses of them moving out of the corners of her eyes. They didn't follow the normal patterns of light and movement, and when she turned to look, there was nothing there. The next time she visited room 137, the elderly man was waiting for her, his sunken face solemn. "It's starting," he said simply. "What's starting?" she demanded, frustration and fear bubbling to the surface. "The collapse," he replied. "My time is ending, and this place won't hold without someone to take my place." Clara stepped back, shaking her head. "I don't understand what you're talking about." "You will," the man said. "Soon." 3 days later, the hospital descended into chaos. It started with the power outage. Every light in the building blinked off at once, leaving the hospital in pitch-black darkness. The emergency generators struggled to kick in, their dim red glow barely illuminating the hallways. Then came the fog. It seeped into the hospital like a living thing, curling under doors and slithering through vents. The air grew damp and cold, and a strange, faint whispering filled the halls. At first, Clara thought it was just the sound of patients and staff panicking. but the whispers carried words, broken, fragmented sentences that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. She ran to the ICU, where a nurse was frantically trying to keep patients calm. "What's happening?" Clara demanded. "I don't know," the nurse replied, her face pale. "People are saying they're seeing things. Shadows, faces. I don't." A loud crash cut her off. Clara turned toward the sound, her heart pounding. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to thicken, stretching upward, like ink spilling into the air. Suddenly, one of the patients screamed. Clara spun around to see a dark figure, humanoid but wrong, its edges flickering like static, dragging a man from his bed. The patient's scream was abruptly silenced as he vanished into the fog. "No!" Clara lunged forward, but her hands grasped nothing but air. She sprinted toward room 137, the whispers growing louder with each step. When she reached the door, she found it ajar, and patient Zero was sitting upright in his bed, waiting for her. "I told you this was coming," he said calmly, though his pale face was drawn with fatigue. "What is this?" Clara shouted. "What's happening to the hospital?" "The darkness is breaking through," he replied. "I've kept it contained for as long as I could, but I'm too weak now. You have to decide if you'll take my place." Clara shook her head, disbelief and terror flooding her mind. "Take your place? I can't do that." "If you don't," he said, his gray eyes piercing hers, "everyone in this hospital will die." The fog grew thicker, and Clara could hear the screams of patients and staff as shadows moved through the building, dragging people into the void. The hospital was unraveling, and Clara knew she had no choice. She turned to patient Zero, her voice trembling. "What do I have to do?" He gave her a faint smile. "You already know." As he spoke, his body began to dissolve, fading into the mist like smoke. His final words lingered in the air. "Anchor yourself here. Become the keeper. Only then can the darkness be contained." Clara's hands trembled as she stepped into the center of room 137. The fog around her swirled violently, and the whispers grew deafening. Shadows lunged at her from every direction, but just before they could reach her, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The room fell silent. Outside, the fog receded, and the hospital returned to an eerie calm. Nurses and doctors emerged from their hiding places, confused but unharmed. Patients were back in their beds, as if nothing had happened. But Clara was gone. Room 137 vanished too. The door of the room, even its memory, it all disappeared. To the rest of the hospital staff, it was as if Clara had never existed. Years later, a young doctor named Emily Carter stumbled upon a forgotten file in the hospital archives. The folder was labeled Room 137 and contained a single photograph, an image of a dark-haired woman standing beside an elderly man with piercing gray eyes. Emily frowned. The names written beneath the photo were unfamiliar to her. Dr. Clara Martinez and patient Zero. "What is this?" she muttered, flipping through the file. There wasn't much else inside, just a cryptic note scrawled in shaky handwriting. "For as long as the hospital stands, someone must watch." Emily glanced at the photo again, her brow furrowed. Something about the woman's eyes seemed familiar, almost like she was looking directly at Emily, urging her to understand. Her pager buzzed suddenly, making her jump. She checked the screen. Room 137. Emily's blood ran cold. The hospital didn't have a room 137. Or did it? She followed the hallways, her heart pounding. When she reached the end of a deserted corridor, she stopped. The wall before her was blank, but as she stared, she could make out the faint outline of a door, barely visible beneath layers of faded paint. "Dr. Carter." The whisper was soft, almost gentle, but it made her skin crawl. She turned around, but the hallway was empty. Emily reached out, her hand hovering over the door's outline. She hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to turn back, but something about the door called to her, just as it had to Clara years before. The story ended as the faint whisper called her name again, "Emily."